everyone. Today, we're gonna talk about Dracula. So, Bram Stoker's Dracula is one of my favorite books, okay? I know I say everything's my favorite because I probably wouldn't make a video out of it if it wasn't. Bram is short for Abraham, by the way, so his name is Abraham Stoker, and he is Irish, actually. And in 1897, he wrote a book that kind of changed horror, specifically Gothic horror, for all time, and later affected film and other books and everything else. So today, we're going to kind of dive in a little bit and talk about his book. What's interesting is Bram Stoker was not famous for writing Dracula. He was famous for a couple other things, like being an assistant to a famous actor and kind of managing a theater. But the popularity of his book, Dracula, kind of came after his death. Some of our favorite characters, obviously Count Dracula, Abraham Van Helsing, which I just realized was probably named after Bram Stoker. I literally never realized that. He named Van Helsing after himself. Wow. So, Dracula fits into kind of a greater movement that was happening called invasion literature. So I have a couple authors here. H. Rider Haggard, Rudyard Kipling, Robert Louis Stevenson, Arthur Conan Doyle, H.G. Wells, all at the time were kind of writing these books about invasions, kind of creatures or, of course, aliens and stuff that were invading kind of the British Empire. And Dracula actually fits in all those books because in the book, he does come over and threaten the people of England. The book was written in the style of the classic Victorian adventure novel, which we'll talk about in other videos. So the readers, as they're reading it, though it was this Gothic horror, they were very used to the way it was written because these travels and adventures that the main character, Jonathan Harker, takes was very well known. It was a very established sort of story. I do want to talk about Vlad Tepes, or Vlad III Dracula, because obviously what everybody thinks is that Count Dracula is Vlad the Impaler. But there's actually evidence to suggest that Bram Stoker actually did not base him on Vlad Tepes. Now, of course, there's the name, Dracula, and that came about because Vlad's father, Vlad II, was part of the Order of the Dragon, dragon being Dracul. And since he was particularly valiant, they gave him this as a title. He was Dracul, and his son then was Dracula, son of the dragon. Now, Dracula was not an uncommon name because of the iconography that was kind of going on at the time. So the fact that this name came along doesn't necessarily mean that Bram Stoker was basing his character off Vlad Tepes. In fact, before, his character was named Count Wampyr, which is a name for vampire, or Vampyr, but he only changed it later to Dracula after the character was kind of established. A lot of people think that he only took bits and pieces of folklore. He did study for 7 years European folklore about vampires, but as far as the history of Romania goes, he may not have based this character on the Wallachian prince or Wallachian prince. Specifically in the book, he makes Count Dracula Romanian and not Wallachian, which at the time was a difference. So that's something I invite everyone to look up. Just an interesting fact that it's likely that there is not a connection between the historical Vlad Tepes and Count Dracula, but there's obviously, you know, the culture of vampires and the name that they share. So in the book, this character, what's very interesting is that this vampire that Bram Stoker had made was kind of one of the characters that influenced the shift of a vampire from kind of a rotting corpse, a revenant, to this sophisticated, gentlemanly person, you know, this kind of immortal prince, this noble that harkens back to the old days and saying how good they were and how valiant people used to be. Count Dracula himself in his early life was a soldier, a statesman, an alchemist, and he was very scientific at the time, but he also dabbled in the dark arts, including studying at the Academy of Scholomance in the Carpathians, and that's where he learned sort of, as they say, how to make this deal with the devil to become this vampire and to have that knowledge. But he was very, very eloquent and very knowledgeable. Some of the powers that he has are very cool. In the book, he is also the origin of werewolf myths because he can turn into a wolf or a bat or a dog. He can also fit through tiny cracks. He can get smaller or larger. And one of my favorites is that in the light of the moon, he can turn to elemental dust in its rays and travel somewhere else. So he's very powerful. But of course, in the book, we are introduced to garlic, to crucifixes, to stuff like that that kind of have power over him. And of course, his greatest power, to turn other people into vampires. If he is eating your blood and taking that blood from you, if you die of that, then you will become a vampire. So people will get weaker and weaker. And in the story, the woman, Jonathan's fiance and later wife, Mina Harker, is preyed upon by Dracula, and Jonathan and Van Helsing and several other people constantly give her blood transfusions in order to save her life. What's interesting is that correlates with the legend of consumption, which is tuberculosis. They called it consumption because they didn't know what caused it, and you would just waste away until you died, and people thought that a vampire was preying on you. Therefore, when these people with tuberculosis died, often they were staked through the heart or buried under a rock or with a brick in their mouth or something, so that they didn't rise up as vampires. So, that being said, I want to talk about a couple of the non-Eastern European influences. One of the influences of Dracula is that Bram Stoker actually ate a lot of crab meat one night and had a crazy nightmare about a king vampire that rose from the dead. And that was actually the main inspiration for his book, is that was the nightmare that he had. Another legend, actually, and another inspiration for Dracula that I want to talk about is an Irish legend. Now, Bram Stoker was Irish, and this character from Irish mythology was called Avartak, or Avartak. I don't know exactly how to say it. Avartak means dwarf, and it was a sorcerer, kind of tyrant, evil guy, Avartak, and he was killed in some legends by Finn McCool, going back to our other video. But Avartak was this evil man that was killed by Finn McCool, buried, and the next day he came back and drank the blood. And he was killed again and buried and came back and drank the blood. And then so after this happened a couple times, Finn McCool went to a druid, asked him how he could vanquish this evil being, and the druid said, you must take you must make a wooden sword from the yew tree and use it to kill him. So this is maybe possibly the beginning of the stake through the heart. Anyway, Finn McCool made this wooden sword from the yew tree, killed Avartak, and buried him under a giant stone, and he never rose again. So what's interesting is that legend of Avartak, this revenant creature, probably influenced Bram Stoker in his own native Irish mythology. So that's everything I have about Bram Stoker's Dracula. Highly recommend reading the book. It is wonderful. I kind of glossed over stuff, but I hope that piqued your interest and transmitted a little bit of story to you guys. So thank you all for listening, and I'll see you again in Another World. Why do I always do it stupid? I should just close the book. I can close the book. Look at me. Closed. Cool. Sweet.